therefore it is ours. You know, as far as the eye can see. No more of that. It also did set the boundary, as I pointed out, along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains to separate Indian territory. But one thing it also does is it recognized that Aboriginal rights existed based on the prior occupation of that land. And he considered the Aboriginal people to have right of soil. The other thing he does is there was one thing that was causing a lot of problems. And that was that individual settlers were trying to either purchase land from native groups or they were just trying to take it from force. And he said, no, 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 you're not going to do that. Why? Because first of all, a lot of these land deals were fraudulent and native people were basically getting swindled out of their territory. But also, he wanted to be able to have a little more control over this. So he said, no, no. If there is going to be purchase of land, it will be handled by the Crown. There will be none of this individual negotiation between an individual landowner wanting to purchase native land. No. The Crown will purchase territory on behalf of the people. It will go through the Crown, and then the Crown will sell land or distribute land to settlers after that. But what he did is he said all of those kinds of negotiations will take place with the Crown through treaties. Treaties must be established first. And nobody else was allowed to negotiate treaties but the Crown, or the Crown's representatives. Those are the only people allowed to negotiate treaties. And it also treated all Aboriginal groups as separate independent nations in these negotiations and reserved the right to allow them to govern themselves in their own territories. It forbade any British colony, and this is right through the empire, from issuing land patents on Indian lands or negotiating treaties. So if you had a little state, for example, like Virginia, no, Virginia was not allowed to negotiate. It was the Crown. So basically, it's kind of like Canada where they say, well, no, the provinces don't get to do it. No, it has to be the feds or the Crown. So this is what it looked like post-1763 again, just to remind you. You've got Spanish territory on the west side of the Mississippi. You've got this Indian Reserve area in the middle. And then you have the U.S. colonies. Now, I would like to say that this worked out really well. In fact, the American settlers did not like it. And this really caused problems in the colonies because they were no longer allowed to just push their way in anymore. That's the way they were used to doing things. They weren't allowed to purchase. They weren't allowed to swindle native people. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade individual purchase or seizure of lands from native people, became one of the quote-unquote intolerable acts that led the American colonists to go to begin the revolution. So the irony of all of this is that this whole thing, the Royal Proclamation, was initially proclaimed to stop an American problem, an American colonial problem of settlers getting pushy and trying to force their way on native land. But what's happened is that Canada is the beneficiary of the Royal Proclamation because this well into the 21st century or 20th century remained British. So, as the only British territory, Canada, in order for it to acquire land for settlement, the government had to purchase the land as well through the treaty process. And this was the practice of purchase that was established by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And of course, you have your numbered treaties. And I won't go into a ton of detail on the numbered treaties, but they were with different tribal groups, and they basically, I would say, moved from east to west with a few adhesions and things in between. But one thing you should understand, without purchase of land via treaty from Native people in Western Canada, you wouldn't have settlers here. It's no accident that the settlement, say, of Alberta and Saskatchewan didn't really start taking place until there was treaty arrangements. It didn't happen. You didn't see any settlers here. Why? Because they weren't allowed to be here because the land had not been purchased yet. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is cited in Section 25 of the Constitution Act, which was when, in 1982, when the Constitution was patriated back to Canada. And basically, the reason it's in Section 25 is that clause guarantees that you cannot limit or terminate Aboriginal rights that were outlined in the proclamation. There has to be a consultation process involved. You can't just arbitrarily go doing things. Changes to federal legislation in Bill C-45 that do infringe on Aboriginal rights, as defined in the Constitution, they have to be negotiated with Aboriginal people, because that is what was established by the Royal Proclamation of 1763. There are territories in Canada, provinces such as British Columbia, because of their unique situation, there's only a tiny bit of the land that was actually purchased through treaty. In essence, a lot of BC is up for grabs because they did not go through the treaty process. And this is one of the big debates. There are a lot of people out there that say, no, that's an old treaty, it doesn't matter. Well, the fact is that on this campus, last week there was a symposium celebrating the Liaison Treaty that was a treaty between France and Germany. At the end, it was in the 60s. Anyway, they had their 50th anniversary. They had a big symposium about it. And if they could celebrate the 50th anniversary of a treaty, I guess treaties must mean something. And if they don't think our treaties that have been signed with Native people in this country are worthy, they think, does this mean that only white people treaties are okay? Anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm giving the same speech tomorrow at between 10 and noon in another part of campus, but thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And Brian, I think you're up next. Get you. Something like that.